So Jedi Survivor has been out for a few months now, and I have finally reached 100 hours of playtime, and today I pretty much wanted to go over essentially my final thoughts on the game. Now that doesn't mean I'm not going to cover the game anymore on the channel, but I did plan once the game was launching that after 100 hours I'd kind of do like almost a second review, going over all of my thoughts now that I've actually sunk the right amount of time into it to give a proper detailed review of the game rather than doing an initial review. So that is what we're going to be going over today. Now obviously we will be talking spoilers here, so if you haven't finished the game, which I dare say most of you probably have, then just be aware of that. And if you haven't finished the game, I would probably recommend clicking off the video. But with that being said, let's get stuck right into it. Now firstly, I personally think that the game was a very clear upgrade on the first game in essentially every single aspect. Now when they announced the second game, I think a lot of people kind of thought it would be very similar to the first one, and don't get me wrong, in a lot of ways it was very similar, but from what we can all tell, it does look as though they pretty much just looked at all the feedback from the first game, took everyone's main complaints from the game, for example, the linear sort of design of the maps, the length of the game, the, I guess, almost one-dimensional combat. It was very good combat in that game, but it was just pretty one-dimensional for the most part, and even stuff like the customization, for example, or the lack thereof. They took the feedback on all of that stuff and essentially just put it into this game, taking all the stuff that was good about Jedi Fallen Order, keeping that pretty much the same, but then just drastically improving every other area of the game that we all pretty much had the same complaints about. I think the main area that was probably improved the most was the combat, at least for me personally, and this is mostly due to those combat stances, which was probably one of the best additions that they could have made. For me, each stance felt pretty much entirely different from the rest, and it really does add to the replayability, not only in completely different saves, going through and playing like the whole game in one stance, for example, but even from like mission to mission, just changing your stance and actually changing up the playstyle. It kind of added to the fun of the game. It didn't feel like the combat was monotonous and just the same thing over and over again. You could approach different areas with different stances, and it kind of kept the combat really fresh and entertaining the whole time. I do remember back in Fallen Order, there were certain parts of the game, not too many, but there were certain parts where I would see a bunch of enemies ahead of me, and even though I do really enjoy the combat of that game, it almost felt a little bit like a chore. It was kind of like, oh, here we go again, I gotta get past all these enemies and then get to the next area of the map. Now in this game I didn't ever have that issue, because every single time I was entering into combat with a bunch of different enemies, pretty much every time I had a different stance, because I was obviously trying them out each time I would get to a meditation point. I wanted to try and figure out which ones I liked the most or which ones were the best, and therefore every time I came across a group of enemies I never felt like it was a chore. Instead I felt like it was a really good opportunity to try the new stance and just try and get better with each different stance that I was using. Now something else that was drastically better than the first game, and this is mostly to do with Kobo. The rest of the planets were pretty similar, I guess, to the first game, but Kobo can definitely not be in that same category, because this map was borderline open world, and this is something that I dare say pretty much all of us wanted from the first game. Don't get me wrong, I do think the map design in the first game, or the level design, was really pretty solid for the most part, but yeah, it was very linear. It kind of funneled you in the one direction and you could only go into certain other little side areas that were pretty shallow. It wasn't anything like deep exploration. It was mostly just like there was a hidden stim off the beaten path, but that was about it. Well, Kobo could not be any more opposite than how they were in the first game. This, like I said, was borderline open world, and I absolutely loved pretty much the entire map of Kobo. I do also really like the fact that they pretty much managed to keep the backtracking elements that were in the first game that I personally did actually enjoy, but managing to put that into an open world, I very rarely have actually seen that be able to be done. The only other games that I can remember playing that have kind of like a mix of open world with also linear map design is probably Elden Ring, which to me has one of the best open worlds in any game ever. And the fact that I'm comparing the map of Elden Ring with Kobo, there's not many bigger praises that I could say, because to me Elden Ring is one of the best games ever made, and in a lot of ways Kobo did actually feel very similar to how Elden Ring's map design played out, because there was very vast open areas of the map that you could just go around and explore, but then there were little like dungeons and areas of the map where it did become linear, and I think that's completely fine as long as it's obviously done properly, which in this game I personally think it was. My only real issue with the planets was that, as I said, the others were pretty much linear, or at least least closer to being linear than obviously Kobo, and I would have loved if they were a bit more open as well, but I do think that they were still probably more open than they were in Fallen Order, and I also understand why they couldn't just do like 7 entire open world planets. That would be a bit ridiculous in a 3-year development cycle. So that one is a bit more of a nitpick, but in a perfect world it would have been cool to have like a bunch of different planets that were just as vast as Kobo. To me, the boss fights were also very, very fun indeed. I think the boss fights in the first game were equally as good. I don't think there was any real difference between the two games in terms of like one had drastically better boss fights or anything like that. For me, I really enjoyed the Ravus fight. That was probably my favorite of the lot, and it was definitely pretty tough to do. I then also obviously loved the Vader boss fight. If you guys know me, I'm obviously a big Darth Vader fan, and so I actually kind of didn't expect to see Vader at all. Like, I wasn't fully shocked when I saw him, but with that being said, it would have made complete sense for him to not show up, so it was still very exciting when he did show up. And then obviously the Bode boss fight at the end as well, that was really fun, and pretty much all of them were fun. I didn't actually have any boss fights in the game where I thought that one was kind of boring. For the most part, all of the like main story ones and even some of the side ones as well, I thought were pretty much all really well done. Now, in terms of story, I do also think it was better than the first game. Now, the thing with the story is that I think story is a bit more subjective, so I'm not going to try and argue my case here. I just personally liked this one better than the first game, but I've also heard people say the complete opposite, and like I said, I'm not going to bother arguing because I do think that is more subjective. Some people are going to like the first one more in terms of the story, and some people are going to like this one more. I thought Cal seemed a lot more like rugged and brutal in this game. He definitely seemed like a child in the first game, which, to be fair, I believe he is actually a teenager in the first game, and so that makes sense, but he definitely seemed like an adult in this version, and I really enjoyed Cal as a character. Funnily enough, I personally didn't actually feel any attachment to Cal from Fallen Order. Now, for context, I played that game 7 times, so it's not like I just played it once and was like, yeah, don't really like Cal. I played it 7 times, and I never really felt attached to him at all. I didn't dislike Cal, but I never kind of thought of him as like a really cool character in Star Wars. However, my opinion of Cal has entirely changed after Survivor. I honestly love Cal now. He is probably one of my favorite characters from any video game in terms of Star Wars, and honestly, he's probably up there in the top, like, I don't know, 15 or 20 just general video game characters, which is a big praise on my end. There's a lot of characters that I'm very attached to across different franchises, and Cal is definitely up there in that, like, upper echelon for me now. There were also some great additions to the, already established cast from Fallen Order. Obviously, the Mantis crew all played a great role in this game, but then the new characters, for example, like Dagan and Bode, I actually really enjoyed those characters as well. So I thought pretty much the entire cast was really well done. There was no characters that I thought were bad or anything like that. Some were obviously better than others. Like, for example, I don't think Dagan was like the crazy big bad that I thought he was going to be, but I did still think he was a cool character and he had a cool little sort of story arc there. And then obviously the same with Bode as well, which was obviously a bit of a twist at the end there. Now, I do think the twists towards the end, not only with Bode, but then also Sia being playable and then dying to Vader, I thought those twists were absolutely insane. I honestly had moments playing this game where my jaw was entirely open. I was sitting here in my office by myself playing the game, and I literally like found myself with my jaw open thinking, what the hell was going on? So I thought the twists were done really well. They didn't feel like they were just put in there for the sake of it. They didn't feel like too wacky or anything like that, which I think can happen when, someone who's telling a story wants to throw in a twist, and you can kind of tell it's just been put in there for the sake of it, or it's like a little bit over the top, and I don't think that was the case with this game at all. I'm not too sure where the story goes from here. As you probably have seen, they've all but confirmed a third game in the franchise. They pretty much said that if this game does well, they want to see this franchise as a trilogy, and I would honestly bet the house that there will be a third game. Like, I'd be completely shocked if we don't get a follow-up to Survivor, whether it is the final one or whether this just continues on. Maybe we get a third installment that's, the finishing of Cal's story, and then there could also be like a fourth game that is not following Cal, for example. So I would be genuinely shocked if we don't get a next one, and I really don't know where the story is going to go. I think it will be about them kind of like restoring the Jedi Order, which is ironic because at the end of the first game, obviously they kind of decided against that, but then obviously Sia went to work and kind of kept not really restoring the Order, but like she was setting up the archive and all those sorts of things. And then there's obviously the whole like thread with Kata, who is Bode's daughter, where I believe she's probably going to be force sensitive, and with Cal and Merrin essentially becoming like her foster parents, I guess. I think there could be a really cool story storyline where even that is potentially where the fourth game, if there were to be one, that could be where it leads, where they, you know, slowly train her to use the Force and stuff like that, just not even to become a Jedi or anything, but just to essentially protect herself. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential there. So I'm not sure where the next game goes, but I cannot wait for that game if obviously it does happen, which, like I said, I'd be shocked if it doesn't, but I definitely could see them making a third game that would be potentially even better than this one. So I cannot wait for that to happen if it does eventually happen. Overall though, for this game, I honestly loved it. For me personally, it is the best Star Wars game of all time. Now obviously that is just my opinion, but I'm very staunch in that opinion. I honestly think it is way better than anything else that we've got. And in terms of single player games, I think for me Battlefront 2 will always be like my favorite. And there are some old school games, Star Wars Starfighter, and some of the really old school Star Wars games that maybe are higher on my favorite list, but in terms of what I think is, you know, from an objective standpoint, the best, I do honestly think this is by far the best Star Wars game we've ever gotten. And like I said, I cannot wait for the next one if we do end up getting it. I'm keen to hear what you guys think of the game though, and also what you guys think of my thoughts on it, whether you think I'm an idiot for saying it is the best Star Wars game of all time, or whether you agree with that statement. Be sure to leave all your thoughts down in the comment section. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and may the Force be with you always.